Welcome back. This is part 2 of the chapter 25 lesson. We're going to start by looking at China. So China, we already know a lot about because you guys have been reading Red Scarf Girl, and we did some writing assignments on China. So hopefully you have a pretty good background knowledge going into this. You remember that in the 1930s, the Japanese invaded China, caused much suffering for the Chinese people. The Japanese were very brutal as they went in and killed and raped many thousands upon thousands of Chinese people. So even to this day, there is a lot of animosity between the two countries because of the legacy of that invasion and the memories that are passed down. The Communist Party during this period does continue and actually thrives. Mao Zedong relies heavily on guerrilla warfare, and this is actually the most effective at combating the advance of the Japanese. So during this period of invasion, it's really the communists that rally the people together the most effectively, and the Chinese start to look to the communists to provide them with hope, to provide them with confidence, not only to fight the Japanese, but then after the Japanese leave, a bond of trust has been formed between the Japanese people and the Communist Party, or the Chinese people and the Communist Party. So essentially, the Japanese invasion of China has the long-term impact of weakening Chiang Kai-shek's Nationalist Party, and that is why in 1949 the nationalists are going to end up fleeing to Taiwan, and Mao Zedong will become the leader of the People's Republic of China. His government will be, the capital will be in Beijing. He will rely heavily on Lin Biao, one of his commanders, and a group of what's called the party cadres. This is a very elite group of communist activists. They will dominate the rule of China. They will oversee the People's Liberation Army, which is basically the army, the communist army, that is responsible for taking over and setting up a government in China. So this is kind of the early communist government in China, relying on this elite group of Communist Party members. Now I want you to remember these party cadres. We're going to come back to them when we get to the Cultural Revolution and talk a little bit about what happened there. So Communist China, as I mentioned in part 1, will come to the aid of North Korea when the U.S. and the UN come in to fight the Korean War, and they try to beat back the North Koreans. Early on in the development of communism in China, you'll remember that basically China was kind of building off of the Soviet Union's model. It was taking the Soviet Union's industrial model of communism and applying it more to a peasant society, where the ideal was an agrarian framework. However, relations with the Soviet Union were okay early on. However, after Stalin's death, Mao Zedong wants to be the top dog. He basically wants to be the one that everybody looks to and says, this is the leader of the communist world. He also doesn't really approve of Khrushchev and the new leadership in the Soviet Union. He thinks they're kind of breaking away from some of the original ideals of communism. We'll also start to see tension around the border between the Soviet Union and China. So for all of those reasons, relations with the Soviet Union are going to break down. So the two largest communist nations in the world in the latter half of the 21st century or 20th century are not going to really get along. China, however, also will be working to prove its military superiority against India. It will defeat India in a border war there. They will also be testing a nuclear device. So China will quickly become a nuclear nation as well. For a brief time, China becomes a nation of peasant landowners. So the peasants actually are given land. The land is taken from the large elite landowners that have ruled China for 2,000 plus years and given to the peasants. However, during the 1950s and 60s, you start to see divisions within the Communist Party. Mao Zedong wants to have a very pure agricultural peasant society. In fact, I think I've talked about this with you guys before, but Mao Zedong didn't really even appreciate education. He thought education was useless. If we're going to have a peasant society, you really don't need that much education. Others, however, in the party start to, sort of look around them and realize that if we don't industrialize, we're going to continue to fall behind the rest of the world. But Mao and his followers are going to be very committed to this ideal of a peasant society. So Mao, in an attempt to follow through, will implement the mass line approach. The mass line approach will collectivize land, meaning that land is taken away from the peasants and basically made into government-owned farms or communes. And you're going to see this in Red Scarf Girl, or you have seen this in Red Scarf Girl, that Zhili goes to work on a commune. And on those communes, the peasants basically live in sort of communal areas. They all eat at one central canteen, and they all go out to work for a standard number of hours. But no one brings home the sort of rewards of his labor. All of the harvest just kind of goes to a central location and is then and everybody is just kind of fed and taken care of by the commune itself. So essentially, there's no real individual incentive going on here. There are accounts, people that lived in China at the time, talked about peasants just going out into the field and taking a nap, because it really didn't matter. At the end of the day, you went to the canteen, you got fed, you didn't have to worry about it. So if you didn't pull your weight, it really didn't matter, because it had no reflection on you at the end of the day. So lack of personal incentive, you see, is going to be one of the things that is going to bring communism down in China, or at least this form of communism. Part of the mass line approach was the Great Leap Forward, and this was kind of implemented a few years in the late 1950s. The Great Leap Forward was Mao's name for his plan to bring industry to China. Now, he didn't want to build factories. We will see some factories in China, and they talked about it a little bit in Red Scarf Girl, but his real vision was to basically have industrial production take place on the farms. So throughout China, you would start to see backyard furnaces, and there's one pictured here. These are very rudimentary furnaces that were created to melt steel or melt metal and to transform it into steel for various industrial uses. Since everyone, even in the cities, everyone ate at a canteen, people were all required to turn in their woks and any of their cooking utensils to be melted down in these furnaces. Mao wanted to become a leader in steel production, and he thought he could do this by just building these small little steel producing facilities in farms, in hospitals, in schools, just basically anywhere, any point where there were people at work. He was going to build a furnace, and some of the employees would have to go and be working on, tending to that furnace. That meant a lot of time, all the hospitals had one. So that meant a lot of times doctors and nurses, rather than caring for patients, had to go out and, stoke the fires and melt down metal. It was just a very silly plan, and we'll soon find that it doesn't really work out. Another component of the Great Leap Forward was in agriculture. Mao Zedong thought, well, if, we're planting crops and we have, 5 bags of seed, maybe 10 bags of seed would be even better. So, rather than spacing out crops, Mao Zedong's plan is just to pour as much seed in and basically plant an area of land as densely as possible to try to grow more crops in the same amount of land. Well, anyone that knows agriculture knows that doesn't work. Plants need space to grow. And so what ends up happening is they have a few good harvests early on, but soon Mao continues to just increase and increase and increase crop density so that they choke each other out. The plants choke one another out, and in addition to that, the land is over-farmed. The soil is never given a chance to rest and rebuild nutrients. So you can guess what happens. Basically, the crops fail and starvation ensues. This is one of the worst periods of starvation in human history. This is where, in one account that I read, peasants and people in China were basically getting 3.5 ounces of meat a month. Now, 3.5 ounces of meat is a little bit more than a recommended serving size for one serving of meat for one meal that we would eat here in America. Most of us probably eat more than 3.5 ounces. If we go and eat a hamburger at Five Guys, that's probably more than that. But basically, you're going to see protein, a lot of protein deficiency that leads to major health problems. One of those is just swelling or edema that ensues. But of course, you can't really get any health care because all the doctors are off, stoking the furnaces. There are accounts of cannibalism happening in the countryside where people are eating their children, primarily girls, because they historically have been less valued in Chinese society. There are accounts of people just leaving their children, sort of off in a wilderness area to die because they can't feed them anymore. It was a really horrific time for China. But what Mao did, and this kind of shows you his very disturbing genius, was that he basically told people throughout China that, or he had his commissioners on the various farms and communes saying, well, the reason you're starving is because there was a natural disaster in another part of China and it's affected us all. And so everybody thought, well, there weren't really too many problems here, our crops failed, but really we're starving because of a natural disaster. Mao couldn't have controlled it. This isn't Mao's fault. And so everyone still continues to go on worshiping Mao despite the fact that his misguided and ill-thought-out plans caused this period of starvation in China. Another factor in it, too, is that even throughout the Great Leap Forward, Mao was telling people to keep having children. There was no, birth control was not acceptable. Birth control was seen as capitalist and selfish. And so you're having children, not able to feed them, and that's just worsening the situation. Eventually, a little bit later in China's, in the trajectory going forward, the two-child policy and then the one-child policy will be implemented. It's a few years before the Great Leap Forward is declared an ultimate failure, and it will cost Mao his position as state chairman. Many people in the upper echelons of the Communist Party realize that this is Mao's fault, but most of the Chinese people have been basically fed this line that it's not Mao's fault, it's because of natural disasters, and they go on worshiping Mao. However, there is a growing segment of the party called the Pragmatists, and this is led by two guys named Zhou Enlai and Liu Shikai. They will start to exert more control over the Communist Party, and they're the ones that are going to promote more industrialization and even some loosening of the communist controls. Now let's talk for a second about women in China. Madame Chiang Kai-shek, who is Chiang Kai-shek's wife, back in the 1940s wanted to return women to traditional roles. On the other hand, Mao, and this is the one positive thing I can say about him, ended foot binding, he ended female seclusion, and he opened up jobs and schools for women. So that's why in Red Scarf Girl you see both mom and dad working, you see women in society participating and being a very active part of that society. Women would even take some leadership roles within the party. The highest, of course, would be reserved for those women with connections, like Mao Zedong's wife. She takes a major leadership role in the party. In fact, it's largely his wife that leads the Cultural Revolution that you read about in Red Scarf Girl. The women still, however, have to fight against traditional views. It's not easy to change a mentality that's been in place for thousands of years. And much like we just talked about in Japan, they are often forced to take the primary responsibility for the domestic duties as well as working a full-time job. All right, so we have a couple slides ago, we have, I said, the pragmatists at the end of the Great Leap Forward. You've got pragmatists arising in the party wanting to move China forward into a more industrial model, wanting to loosen some of the communist controls. Mao Zedong and his wife feel very threatened by the rise of the pragmatists. They fear that the pragmatists will take over and ultimately oust Mao Zedong from all control. And so they start this grassroots campaign. And as we read about in Red Scarf Girl, they are going to primarily employ the youth of China. Now remember I said way back a couple slides ago, the party cadres, the People's Liberation Army, they were the ones that had started communism that Mao relied upon early on. A lot of those old guard party cadres that helped to establish communism in the 1940s, they will actually be targeted. There were people who had been elite members of the Communist Party in the 1940s and early 1950s that will actually be sent to labor camps for re-education because they are not communist enough. And I think you see a lot of that in Red Scarf Girl. Now, of course, Gilly's family has a landlord background, but just because, even if you had a Communist Party background, that didn't mean you were safe. Because a lot of times, the Red Guard suspected these sort of old school communists of aligning with the pragmatists. And once again, the whole point of the Cultural Revolution was to take out Mao Zedong's opponents within the party, was to take out those pragmatists because they were not pure enough. They did not share his vision of a peasant agricultural society. So you see the public humiliation, the beatings, you've seen all of that in Red Scarf Girl. Eventually, by about 1968, the movement has gone too far. The People's Liberation Army gets together and disbands the student movements, kind of at the point where chaos is about to break out. And you start to see a movement toward a more rational form of leadership after that. Mao Zedong's wife will lead what's called the Gang of Four. And the Gang of Four during the Cultural Revolution is really this group of the purist Maoist communists that are charging the pragmatists of capitalist leaning. So they're trying to root out all of these people in the Communist Party that might be rightist or capitalist. So again, even those in the Communist Party were targeted. Eventually, the Gang of Four is stopped by leaders of the military. Mao's wife and other members of the party are sentenced for life, and as a result of the Cultural Revolution, basically Mao and Madame Mao Zedong will be ousted from power, and the pragmatist Deng Xiaoping will come to power. He will allow some capitalist inroads into China. So, for example, he'll end collectivization, he'll allow private land ownership again, he'll encourage private investment, not only in land, but also in industry, and he starts to open China up to foreign business chains. So that's where you'll start to see some restaurant chains and some other clothing chains and technology like Apple coming into China. I mean, Apple will be a little bit later, but they have a huge presence there today. All right, so some successes of the Communist Revolution. Overall, poverty remains, but you could say, with the exception of during the Great Leap Forward, people end up better off than before. China will, once we get over the Great Leap Forward, they will achieve higher rates of industrial growth. The population as a whole has more access to food, education, and healthcare. And China has been able to do this with very little assistance from outside. So that's one way that China is unique. China is on track to continue its impressive growth throughout the 21st century, and it has really overtaken a lot of other nations in the region on its fast track towards growth. Here is a graph of population growth. Notice how China's population growth is projected in 2050 to be much higher. In fact, Europe's population is shrinking. People are having less children, and people are moving out of Europe. Here in the United States, our population is still growing, but that's mostly due to immigration, because people are having less children. They're not sustaining population growth through births, but it is through immigration. Moving on now to Vietnam. So let's go through a brief history of Vietnam. Much of this we've talked about, but I know it's been a while. In 1802, the French, who have been training in Vietnam, will aid the Nguyen family from taking over Vietnam from the Tai Son rule. And the Nguyen and Tai Son are the two kind of major rival families throughout Vietnam. The French enjoy advantages in the Nguyen court, and they are allowed to continue some missionary efforts. So a lot of Vietnamese are going to convert to Catholicism. Again, the French have not taken over yet. They have a presence. However, in 1820, relations begin to break down because the new Confucian leader of Vietnam, Minh Mang, starts to persecute a lot of Vietnamese Catholics. And the French use this now as justification. They are going to defend their Catholics, those that they have converted to Catholicism, and they will implement a military force to come in and seize control, and Vietnam will become a French colony. Under the French, we'll see the exploitation of peasants continue. The Vietnam will be used heavily for raw materials and resources well into the 20th century. However, during the early 20th century, we'll start to see the rise of the Vietnamese Nationalist Party and the Communist Party of Vietnam. So the Nationalist Party, the VNQDD, this is a party made up largely of the French-educated children of Vietnamese elites. So these are Vietnamese who have gotten themselves in good with the French government, sent their children to schools, many times in France, and those children learned about Enlightenment ideals, learned about the independence movements in the Americas, and wanted to have their own in Vietnam. The Communist Party will be led by Ho Chi Minh. This will fill the void once the VNQ-DD kind of falls. The Viet Minh will be another party to arise, and they will establish control after World War II. Once Vietnam is liberated from the Japanese, the Viet Minh kind of come in, and they are the non-communist option. Vo Nguyen Giap will lead guerrilla forces. He will be responsible for taking out the Japanese and exerting control over the north. He will continue to push against French control in the south. So despite the fact that there's international assistance supporting the French will lose control of Vietnam once the Viet Minh capture the fortress at Dien Bien Phu. The Geneva Conference ultimately will provide for an independent Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north and free elections throughout Vietnam. So shortly after World War II, the French are ousted and Vietnam is supposed to become a free democratic society. The U.S. will seek to support the leader Ngo Dinh Diem in the south. Dinh Diem is not a communist, but also not really a supporter of democracy. And we talked about this in chapter 33. We've talked about this throughout. The United States here is mainly interested in containing communism. So even if we're supporting someone who is repressive and oppressive, that's okay as long as they're not communist. Diem seeks to eliminate any of his political rivals. But what we start to see is continuing support for the communists in both the North and the South. The Viet Cong, which is the communist movement, grows rapidly throughout the early days of independence and lead resistance movements against Diem. Eventually, the U.S. realizes that we don't really want to support Diem anymore. But we also don't want to publicly end our support for him. So what is believed to have happened is that the U.S., through some back channels, orchestrated the Diem assassination in order for our generals to come in and start a war against the Viet Cong. Because essentially, the whole point is get rid of the Viet Cong, put someone in charge who is not communist. So the United States throughout the 1960s will ramp up our involvement in Vietnam. Basically, the President Lyndon B. Johnson is given a blank check to take whatever means necessary. And what ironically we will find is that even our advanced firepower cannot overtake this guerrilla force of communists, and the Viet Cong grow by the day. They are not traditional soldiers. They do not wear uniforms. We don't actually know who's Viet Cong and who's not. And so after several years in the country, over a decade in Vietnam, and the loss of 60,000 American lives, the U.S. diplomats ultimately pull out in 1973. Civil war continues for about 2 more years until the South falls to communism in 1975. The picture over here on the right is a famous image that was published around the world. This was early on under Diem. Diem was a Catholic, one of the reasons why the U.S. felt more supportive to him. Catholicism was something we understood a little bit more. But Diem was Catholic, and he actually persecuted a lot of Buddhist monks. And so this monk was burning himself alive in Saigon to protest the persecution of Buddhists. So what are the results of the Vietnam War? Basically, the U.S. cut off relations with Vietnam. The United States failed at its objective of containing communism. Vietnam did become a fully communist country, and because of that, we embargoed them economically until the 1990s. The leaders in Vietnam maintained a very rigid communist system for much of that time, and because of that, their economic growth was really stifled. However, as you start to see by the 1980s, 1990s, increasing investment from Europe and Japan, you will start to see the liberalization of the economy. So it is not a purely communist economy today. There is kind of a mixture of some capitalism and private investment and communism as well. In the 1990s, under the Clinton administration, we normalized relations with Vietnam. We also got some questions answered about the fate of some of the missing POWs that had never really been reported on, and we've started to see improved relations with the country since. Overall, with the decline of communism, you have seen an increasing class disparity in Vietnam. It is still a struggling economy today. Education and healthcare are still not adequate. Many companies employ cheap labor in sweatshops. Many, children and young adults are, rather than going to school, are working in sweatshops throughout Vietnam today. And this is a picture here at the bottom of one such sweatshop that is a supplier to Abercrombie and Fitch, which employs a lot of women, especially a lot of very young women throughout the country. So a lot of times in these sweatshops, the people that work there lie about their age too, so that's one way that they get around the controls. But we have good information that in many parts of Vietnam, the people working are underage and basically sacrificing an education to work and support their families. So that's just something to be aware of as you, become a consumer in a global economy, to be a responsible consumer and think about that when you make purchases. So in conclusion, what we've seen in Asia is a blending of communism and capitalism. China is no longer purely communist, but it's certainly not purely capitalist. Even South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, not purely capitalist. A lot of government controls in those nations. We see the rise of Asian giants like China, like Japan, like South Korea, and then the little tigers, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia. But traditional cultures remain, sometimes in tension with Western values. And then just to close us off, of course, I have here a picture of a McDonald's in Japan. McDonald's has really become an iconic corporation and symbolizes the globalization of the world. And one of the reasons why McDonald's has been so successful worldwide is because it adapts its menu to local culture. So for example, you have here on the left a picture of the teriyaki, this is a McRice burger in Thailand. I actually tried one of these when I was there. I would not recommend it, but it is a good cultural experience if you are there. I wouldn't recommend it as a, daily part of your diet. But definitely an interesting food choice to try if you ever travel to that region. But in Japan, you can buy a teriyaki burger. In India, they have a lot of food choices that do not involve beef because Hindus do not eat beef, and they have a lot of more vegetarian options. So McDonald's has really been very successful at modifying to the local culture and marketing itself very well. Another thing that you'll find in Asian McDonald's is the portion sizes are much, much, much smaller, which again is sort of a testament to the United States obsession with, bigger is better. That's not necessarily the case at a Japanese or Thai McDonald's. Much more reasonable portion sizes there. So that wraps us up with chapter 35. And that's all I got. Have a nice day.